"Tell him he's my grandson when he arrives," whispered the blind lady beside me, her pale fingers squeezing my wrist with surprising strength. I was sitting on that cold hospital bench, still shivering from the rain that had soaked me on my run there. My wife Linda had kicked me out of the house 3 hours earlier, screaming that I was a failure, that at 62 I was nothing more than a dead weight she could no longer bear to carry. "Get a hotel and don't come back," were her last words before throwing my suitcase onto the sidewalk. The woman beside me couldn't have been more than 70, but she radiated a strange authority. Her blue eyes were completely opaque, but she stared at me as if she could see through my soul. "I don't understand, ma'am," I muttered, still confused by the bizarre situation. "Why would I do that?" "Because the man who is about to walk into this room is someone you know," she replied with a smile that gave me chills. "And when he sees you here with me, pretending to be my family, he will discover something that will change everything. My name is Dan Morrison, and for 35 years, I believed I knew my own life. I worked as an accountant at a small company in Portland, maintained a marriage I thought was stable, and lived a predictable and secure existence. But at that moment, sitting next to that mysterious woman in the cold hospital hallway, I began to realize that maybe I didn't know anything about anything. "My grandson will be here in 5 minutes," she continued, her voice low but firm. "When that happens, you'll understand why fate brought us to the same place at the same time." I looked around. The hospital was practically empty, with only a few nurses walking through the hallways. The rain continued to beat against the windows, creating a hypnotic sound that seemed to lull the secrets that woman held. "How do you know I'm going to help you?" I asked. She smiled again, and this time her smile carried a deep sadness. "Because you were also abandoned today. Because you also know how much it hurts to be discarded by those who should love you. And because, like me, you are about to discover that we are not always the victims we think we are." My heart raced. How did she know about Linda? How did she know that I had been thrown out on the street like trash after decades of dedication? "Who are you?" I whispered. "Someone who has been through what you are going through," she replied. "And someone who has learned that the sweetest revenge is not the one that destroys our enemies. It is the one that rebuilds us." At that moment, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. The woman squeezed my arm tighter. "He's coming," she whispered. "Remember, you are my grandson visiting his sick grandmother. And when he comes in, watch his reaction closely." The door opened slowly. The man who entered made my blood run cold. It was Richard Blackstone, my former boss. The same man who had fired me 2 years ago, citing budget cuts, only to hire his 25-year-old nephew to replace me. The same man who destroyed my career and indirectly, my marriage. If you're enjoying this story of twists and unexpected discoveries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this impossible encounter would change everything. But what happened when Richard saw me there, pretending to be the grandson of that mysterious woman, was only the beginning of a revelation that would completely shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. Richard Blackstone stopped in the doorway as if he had been punched in the stomach. His eyes shifted from me to the blind lady, then back to me, clearly trying to process what he was seeing. "Dan," he murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. "Dan Morrison? What the hell are you doing here?" The woman beside me squeezed my arm tighter, reminding me of the role I was supposed to play. "Hello, Richard," I replied with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. "I'm visiting my grandmother. She hasn't been feeling very well lately." Richard frowned, clearly confused. He knew my family, knew that my grandparents had died years ago. But the blind lady reached out a trembling hand toward his voice. "You must be Dr. Blackstone," she said in a sweet, fragile voice. "My grandson told me about you. He said you worked together for many years." The discomfort on Richard's face was visible. He looked at me again, as if trying to decipher an impossible riddle. "We did work together, yes," he replied hesitantly. "But I didn't know Dan had a grandmother alive." "Oh, my dear grandson has always been very secretive about his family," she continued, her words sounding perfectly convincing. "Especially after that problem at work. He was so devastated when he lost his job. He could hardly bring himself to tell me." I saw Richard swallow hard. The embarrassment in his eyes was delightful to watch. Richard Blackstone was the kind of man who fed off the power he wielded over others. At 52, he had built his career on strategic layoffs and family favoritism. When he fired me from Pinnacle Accounting, where I had worked for 28 years, He made sure to make the process as humiliating as possible. Dan just didn't fit in with the young culture of the company anymore, he had said in front of the entire team. We need fresh minds, not dinosaurs stuck in the past. 2 weeks later, he hired Marcus, his 25-year-old nephew, a recent graduate with no practical experience, to take my position. Marcus earned 60% of what I did, but Richard had cut the department's budget, citing economic necessity. The dismissal didn't just destroy my career. Linda, my wife, began to look at me with increasing contempt with every unsuccessful job interview, with every bill that arrived that I couldn't pay. Within 2 years, our 3-decade marriage had turned into a silent war of resentment. It's terrible when companies discard dedicated employees, the woman continued, her voice laden with genuine sadness that made Richard shift uncomfortably. Dan told me you were very upfront about the reasons for the layoffs. Well, they were difficult decisions, Richard muttered, clearly wanting to change the subject. The industry is constantly changing. Of course, she nodded understandingly. But it must be rewarding to see how things worked out for everyone afterwards. Dan told me that the young man who took your place is doing wonderfully. Richard seemed surprised that I knew about Marcus. In fact, I knew nothing about how Marcus was doing, but Richard's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Marcus is learning, he replied cautiously. Oh, how nice. I'm sure he's completely justifying the decision to replace my grandson with him, she smiled. After all, Dan had almost 3 decades of experience. It must have been an easy choice to find someone better qualified. The silence that followed was delightful. Richard opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. It was at that moment that I noticed something extraordinary about the woman beside me. Every word she uttered was carefully chosen to cause as much discomfort as possible, but in a way that could not be questioned. She was not being hostile or confrontational. She was simply making perfectly reasonable questions and statements that exposed the questionable nature of Richard's decisions. Actually, Richard cleared his throat, I need to talk to the doctors about my mother's treatment. It was interesting to see you, Dan. Is your mother ill? The lady asked with genuine concern. Oh, my heart breaks for families going through difficult times. Dan and I understand that very well, don't we, dear? She looked at me with those dull eyes that somehow seemed to see right through my soul. Yes, Grandma, I replied, my voice sounding firmer than I expected. We understand exactly what it's like when important people become vulnerable. Richard gave me a piercing look, as if trying to figure out if there was some hidden meaning in my words. Well, he said finally, I hope your grandmother gets better soon. Thank you, dear, she smiled. And I hope your mother does too. It's terrible when people we love become defenseless. After Richard left the room, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The lady turned to me with a smile that was completely different from the sweet, fragile expression she had shown Richard. That was interesting, she murmured. How did you know? I asked. How did you know he was my former boss? My dear Dan, she replied, some coincidences are simply destiny in disguise. And sometimes, when the universe puts us in the right place at the right time, it's because there are scores to be settled. Her fingers drummed softly on the arm of the chair. Now, tell me about Marcus, she said casually. The nephew who took your place. I have a feeling there's a lot more to this story than Richard is willing to admit. I looked at her with a mixture of admiration and caution. Whoever this woman was, she had just given me a masterful demonstration of how to disarm someone using only carefully chosen words. But what intrigued me most was the growing certainty that our meeting had not been accidental. And if she knew about Richard, about Marcus, about my dismissal, what else did she know? More importantly, what exactly did she plan to do with this information? The revelation about Marcus came as a punch in the stomach. Over the next 2 hours, sitting in that hospital corridor next to the mysterious lady, I discovered details about my former company that made my blood boil. She knew things that only someone on the inside could know. Marcus Blackstone didn't last 6 months in his position, she told me in that calm voice that contrasted with the bomb she was dropping. 3 major clients canceled contracts due to gross miscalculations. The company lost approximately $200,000. My throat went dry. $200,000. I had spent 28 years building relationships with these clients, ensuring that every comma, every number, every deadline was religiously respected. In 6 months, Marcus had destroyed decades of work. How do you know this? I asked, my voice barely coming out. She smiled, that same enigmatic expression she had used with Richard. My dear Dan, when you lose your sight, you develop other senses. And sometimes, those senses include the ability to hear conversations that people think they are having in private. That's when I began to understand. Richard wasn't at the hospital visiting just any ordinary patient. He was there visiting someone close enough that family and professional tensions spilled over into bedside conversations. Your mother is here, isn't she? I asked. Dorothy Blackstone, room 312. Heart problems. And when a man is stressed, worried about his sick mother and facing a financial crisis at work, he tends to speak louder than he should on the phone in the hallways. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anger rising in my chest. Richard had fired me to favor his incompetent nephew, destroying my career and my marriage in the process. But poetic justice was unfolding. The decision was costing him dearly too. There's more, she continued, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. 3 federal auditors were at the company last week. It seems that some tax reports filed in recent months contained discrepancies. My heart raced. I knew those reports. I had created the templates, established the protocols, trained the entire team on the required federal standards. If Marcus had tampered with them without understanding the implications. How many discrepancies are we talking about? I asked, even though I already suspected the answer. Enough to turn a routine audit into a federal investigation. I closed my eyes and leaned against the wall. For 2 years, I had blamed myself for losing my job, wondering if I really was a dinosaur as Richard had said. Linda had hammered home that insecurity every day, reminding me that I was too old and out of touch with the modern world. But it wasn't true. I hadn't lost my job because of incompetence. I had lost it because Richard prioritized nepotism over qualifications, and now his entire company was paying the price. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. She turned to me, her dull eyes seeming to see directly into my soul. Because I recognize the sound of a man who has been unjustly broken. And because I believe that some people deserve a second chance to write their own stories. Her words echoed in the empty hallway. For 2 years, I had been just a victim, passively accepting everything that had happened to me. But standing there, discovering that my dismissal had been even more unjust than I had imagined, something began to change inside me. There is a disciplinary hearing scheduled for next week, she continued. The board of directors at Pinnacle Accounting will decide whether to remove Richard from the presidency. They are considering calling former employees to testify about questionable hiring practices. My mind began to race. If there was an investigation into hiring practices, my dismissal would be examined. The records would show that I had been replaced by someone clearly less qualified, who had caused massive losses to the company. Have they called me to testify? I asked. Not yet. But if someone were to contact the board, mentioning they had relevant information about personnel management and tax practices, well, they would be very interested. I looked at her with a mixture of admiration and caution. This woman wasn't just offering information. She was handing me a weapon. You want me to sue the company? I want you to regain your dignity, she replied firmly. Richard Blackstone destroyed your career to benefit an incompetent relative. That caused damage not only to you, but to the entire company, its employees, and the customers who trusted the quality of the work. She paused, letting the words sink in. Sometimes, Dan, justice isn't about revenge. It's about righting what has been wronged. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, hope. Not the vague hope that things would magically get better, but the concrete hope that I could do something to change my situation. What would I need to contact the board? I asked. Documentation. Correspondence. Anything that shows you were treated unfairly or that raises questions about your replacement's competence. My mind went back to the day I was fired. Richard had been so confident, so dismissive, that he didn't bother to supervise me as I cleared my desk. I had been meticulous throughout my career, keeping copies of everything. Emails, performance reviews, correspondence with clients, even recordings of some meetings where I had expressed concerns about tax guidelines. It was all in a box in my old home office. A box Linda had ordered me to throw away, but which I had secretly stored in my brother's attic. I have documentation, I said, my voice sounding firmer than it had in months. She smiled, and this time her expression carried something I hadn't seen before: pride. "I knew you did," she murmured. "Men like you always keep records. It's part of the meticulous nature that makes them good at what they do." We were silent for a few minutes. In the hallway, nurses hurried by, machines beeped, life and death danced their eternal dance. But inside me, something had fundamentally changed. For 2 years, I had seen myself as a victim of corporate modernization, a dinosaur discarded by a world that no longer needed me. But the truth was much simpler and much more infuriating. I had been discarded because of nepotism, replaced because of incompetence, and left to bear the blame for the problems that followed. "There's one more thing you should know," the lady said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "What?" "Dorothy Blackstone, Richard's mother, was my best friend for 40 years. Before she became ill, she told me about her concerns regarding her son's business dealings. She never approved of the way he fired you." My jaw dropped. Richard's mother? My mind tried to process this revelation. Is she conscious? Can she speak? Occasionally. The doctors say she has a few days, maybe a week. But in her lucid moments, she expresses a lot of regret about the decisions her son has made. An idea began to form in my mind. An idea that made me feel simultaneously guilty and hopeful. "Do you think she would talk to me?" You were silent for a long moment. When you finally answered, your voice carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. "Dan, some conversations change everything. And some opportunities only come once. If you want answers, if you want closure, or if you want the chance to hear the truth from someone who knows Richard better than anyone else in the world." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I understood. In the next 24 hours, I would have the opportunity to talk to the only person in the world who could not only confirm the injustice of what had happened to me, but potentially provide information that would completely transform my case against Richard. But it also meant confronting a dying woman about her son's sins. It meant using her regret as a weapon against him. I looked at the blind lady beside me, this strange guardian angel who had appeared in my life at the exact moment I needed her most. "How do I know I can trust you?" I asked. She smiled, and this time her expression was kinder than I had seen before. "Because, my dear Dan, when you have nothing left to lose, the only thing that remains is the truth. And the truth always finds a way to reveal itself." It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. Not just about my quest for justice against Richard, but about who I really was when faced with the opportunity to reclaim my life. But before I could answer, before I could commit to the path she was offering me, I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Richard was coming back. And this time, he didn't look happy at all. Richard walked back down the hallway with heavy steps and an expression I hadn't seen before. It was no longer the awkward discomfort of our first conversation. It was pure anger. He stopped in front of us and stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Dan, I need a word with you. Privately." The lady squeezed my arm gently, an almost imperceptible gesture that reassured me. "Sure, Richard. But here is fine. My grandmother has hearing difficulties." His jaw tightened. He knew I was lying, but he couldn't call an elderly lady a liar without looking like a monster. "I just spoke to my mother," he said, his voice low but laden with menace. "She mentioned that you two are old acquaintances." I felt my stomach sink. If Dorothy had told Richard about her friendship with the lady, our game could be over. "Dorothy is a wonderful woman," the lady replied calmly. "She's always been very kind to me. Especially after I lost my sight." "Funny," Richard continued, his eyes shifting from me to her repeatedly. "She also mentioned some concerns about decisions I've made at the company recently." The air grew thick. I could feel the tension building between them like a taut string about to snap. "Mothers always worry," she said softly. "It's in their nature to question whether we're making the right decisions, especially when it comes to how we treat people." Richard took a step closer, his voice growing lower and more threatening. "Listen here, lady. What is your name again?" "Margaret," she replied without hesitation. "Margaret Porter." "Margaret. I don't know what little game you two are trying to play, but I wasn't born yesterday. Dan here was fired for incompetence. Period. And if he's trying to use a sick lady for some kind of blackmail or manipulation scheme." "Richard," I interrupted him, my voice firmer than I expected. Are you accusing your grandmother of participating in some kind of scheme? He stopped, realizing the trap I had set. Anything he said now would sound like he was attacking an elderly blind woman. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, he muttered. I'm just saying that coincidences like this are suspicious. Suspicious. Margaret repeated, her voice carrying a note of hurt surprise. My dear, I came to visit Dorothy because she is my oldest friend. And I brought my grandson with me because he is going through a difficult time. If that is suspicious to you. She didn't finish the sentence, but let the weight of the implication hang in the air. Richard realized he was rapidly losing ground. Every word that came out of his mouth made him seem more paranoid and cruel. Look, he said, trying to change the tone. I just don't want my mother to be upset with stories about the company. She's very ill and you're worried she'll find out the truth about how you treat loyal employees. Margaret asked innocently. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at us for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides. I could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation without looking even worse. I'm going back to my mother's room, he said finally. And I hope that when I return, you will have found another place to have your family meeting. After he walked away, Margaret turned to me with a smile that was as triumphant as it was concerned. He's scared, she murmured. Men like Richard only get aggressive like this when they feel they're losing control. Do you think he's going to cause trouble? Oh, my dear Dan, he's already causing trouble. The question is whether we're going to let him intimidate us or whether we're going to use that aggression against him. It was at that moment that something clicked in my mind. For 2 years, I had let humiliation and shame paralyze me. But seeing Richard so desperately trying to maintain control of the situation made me realize something. He was afraid. And people who are afraid make mistakes. Margaret, I said, using the fake name she had given me. You said you have documentation about the problems at the company. How detailed is this documentation? Her smile widened. Very detailed. Dorothy may be dying, but she has spent the last few months telling me about all her concerns about her son's business. Correspondence, phone conversations she overheard, documents he left lying around the house. My mind began to race. If I could combine Margaret's information with my own documentation, I would have a solid case against Richard. But I had to be strategic. Are there specific records about my dismissal? Yes. Dorothy showed me emails between Richard and the board of directors. They were concerned about his decision to fire you, especially since you were the most respected senior accountant in the company. Richard had to justify the decision several times. I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. For 2 years, I had assumed that my dismissal had been accepted without question. Discovering that it had generated internal controversy completely changed the dynamic. What about Marcus? The problems he caused. All documented. Reports of dissatisfied customers, costly corrections, even an emergency board meeting where they discussed the possibility of firing Marcus and offering you your job back. My heart raced. Did they consider rehiring me? Yes. But Richard argued that it would set a dangerous precedent, that it would show weakness in leadership. He said he would rather absorb the losses than admit he had made a mistake. For a moment, I was speechless. Richard's pride had been more important than the well-being of the company. And now, with a federal investigation underway, his stubbornness was about to cost much more than $200,000. Margaret, I said, I need your help to do something. Something that could be risky for both of us. She leaned closer. Go on. I want to document a conversation with Dorothy. I want her to tell, in her own words, about the concerns she had with Richard's decisions. If she's willing to talk, I can record the testimony. Margaret was silent for a long moment. She's very weak, she said finally. And Richard will be back soon. Then we have to act now. She nodded slowly. Are you sure you want to do this, Dan? Once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Richard will fight with everything he's got. I looked down the hallway, in the direction Richard had disappeared. I thought of Linda throwing me out on the street, of 2 years of job rejections, of sleepless nights wondering if I really was the failure everyone seemed to think I was. I'm tired of being a victim, I said. It's time to fight back. Margaret smiled, and this time her expression carried something I recognized as maternal pride. "Then let's talk to Dorothy. But first." She took a small digital recorder out of her pocket. "I've always been ready for this conversation. The question was whether you would be ready to hear the answers. If you're following this journey of justice and discovery, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what Dorothy Blackstone was about to reveal would change not only my destiny, but the future of everyone who had been harmed by her son's arrogance." We walked toward room 312, each step bringing us closer to answers I had sought for 2 long years. But it also brought us closer to a confrontation that would change everything forever. Because sometimes, the difference between justice and revenge isn't in the actions we take, but in the moment we finally decide to stop accepting injustice in silence. Room 312 was bathed in soft twilight when we entered. Dorothy Blackstone looked tiny in the hospital bed, her frail body almost disappearing among the white sheets. But when Margaret whispered her name, her eyes opened with surprising clarity. "Margaret?" "My dear friend," Dorothy murmured, her voice hoarse but steady. "You came." "I brought someone with me," Margaret said gently, guiding my hand to Dorothy's. "This is Dan Morrison." Dorothy squeezed my hand with unexpected strength. Her eyes studied me for a moment before widening with recognition. "The accountant," she sighed. "Oh, my dear Dan. Richard has told me about you so many times. Always with such guilt." My heart raced. "Guilt?" "Dorothy," Margaret said softly, "Dan came because he needs to know the truth. About what really happened at the company. About why Richard fired him." Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she reopened them, there was a determination in them that contrasted with her physical frailty. "Turn on the recorder, Margaret. It's time for Richard to face the consequences of his choices." Margaret discreetly activated the small digital recorder. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitors. "Dan," Dorothy began, her voice gaining strength, "my son fired you because you refused to falsify tax reports to cover up the losses Marcus was causing." The floor seemed to move beneath my feet. "I refused to falsify reports?" 3 weeks before your dismissal, Richard approached you asking you to adjust some numbers in the quarterly reports. You said you couldn't compromise your professional integrity, that there were federal laws involved. The memories began to flood back. The meeting in Richard's office, his strangely vague language about accounting flexibility, my firm response about ethical standards. I had interpreted it all as a theoretical discussion about methodologies. He couldn't fire you for refusing to engage in illegal activities without exposing himself, Dorothy continued. So he created the narrative about corporate modernization. He told the board that you were resistant to change, that you couldn't adapt to the new systems. But there was more. She paused to cough. Richard had been embezzling company funds for 2 years, creating phantom consultants to drain resources. You unknowingly were getting too close to the truth in your monthly analyses. Margaret gave me a meaningful look. I was shaking, not from fear, but from a growing anger that mixed indignation with relief. My dismissal had not been about incompetence. It had been about integrity. "Dorothy," I said, my voice barely controlled, "do you have evidence of this?" "At home, in Richard's office, there's a locked drawer where he keeps everything. Fake contracts, bank transfers, correspondence. Even recordings of compromising conversations." It was at that moment that the door burst open. Richard stormed in, his eyes darting from me to Margaret, then to the tape recorder in her hands, and finally to his mother. "What the hell is going on here?" he roared. Dorothy didn't seem intimidated. If anything, her son's presence seemed to embolden her. "I'm telling the truth, Richard. Something you should have done a long time ago." "Mom, you're delirious. The medication is making you confused." "I'm not confused," Dorothy interrupted him with surprising firmness. "I know exactly what you did to Dan, to the company, to the clients. I know about the $2 million embezzled through JMK Consulting." Richard turned pale as if he had been punched. "You don't know what you're talking about. JMK Consulting is a shell company you created using the initials of my maiden name," Dorothy continued relentlessly. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? 40 years of marriage to your father taught me to recognize financial schemes." Margaret raised the tape recorder slightly. "All of this is being documented, Richard." "Turn that off now," Richard demanded, taking a step toward Margaret. "You have no right to record private conversations in a hospital setting." "Actually," I said, finally finding my voice, "Dorothy gave us explicit permission. And as a voluntary witness statement, it's perfectly legal." Richard turned to me with a fury I had never seen before. "You. I thought I had gotten rid of you permanently." "Gone? Or just hidden evidence?" "Evidence of what?" he practically shouted. "You were fired because you were a substandard employee who refused to participate in tax fraud," Dorothy interrupted him once again. "Richard, stop lying. I'm dying. I'm not going to waste my last days protecting your bad choices." The silence that followed was tense, like a string about to snap. Richard looked from his mother to me, then to Margaret, like a cornered animal looking for a way out. That's when I realized something crucial. Richard wasn't just angry. He was panicking. And people who panic make mistakes. "How many people know about this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Richard James Blackstone," Dorothy said with the authority of a mother confronting a disobedient child, "you are threatening witnesses in a hospital room. In front of your dying mother." Margaret smiled calmly. "Oh dear, this is being recorded too." Understanding washed over Richard's face in waves. First surprise, then disbelief, finally that rare moment of absolute clarity when he realized not only that he had lost, but exactly how. "You can't prove anything," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "We can prove everything," I said, feeling a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. "Dorothy has already given us the location of the documents. Margaret has 2 hours of recordings of your indiscreet phone conversations in the hallways. And I have 28 years of meticulous documentation on every project, every client, every discrepancy I noticed but couldn't explain at the time." Richard opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. "But there's more," Margaret said casually. "Dorothy told me about the federal auditor you tried to bribe last week. It turns out he's my nephew." What little color remained in Richard's face drained completely. "Impossible." "Michael Porter, senior auditor with the Internal Revenue Service. My younger sister's son. He called me last week, very concerned about an improper bribe attempt he had received." It was at that moment that Richard fully understood the scale of what was happening. It wasn't just his position that was compromised, nor just his reputation. It was his freedom. Dorothy closed her eyes, but her voice remained firm. "Richard, you have a choice now. You can try to continue lying, threatening, and manipulating. Or you can finally do the right thing." She opened her eyes and looked directly at her son. "Dan Morrison deserves more than an unfair dismissal. He deserves a full retraction, financial compensation, and public acknowledgement of the truth. And you're going to give it to him. Because if you don't, these recordings are going straight to the FBI tomorrow morning." Richard looked at me with a mixture of hatred and despair. "How much do you want?" It was my turn to smile. "Richard, you still don't understand. It's not about money. It was never about money." I paused, savoring the moment. "It's about justice. And justice, my former boss, is priceless." The door opened once again. This time, it was 2 federal agents in dark suits. Margaret smiled sweetly. "Oh, I forgot to mention. Michael didn't just call me to tell me about the bribery attempt. He also asked to be notified if there were any developments in the case." Richard collapsed into the chair next to the bed, finally realizing that there were no more ways out, no more tricks, no more people to manipulate or blame. The truth had finally caught up with Richard Blackstone. And I was about to discover that poetic justice is even sweeter when you don't have to get your own hands dirty to achieve it. 6 months later, I was sitting on the same hospital bench where it all began. But this time, it wasn't as a defeated man waiting for crumbs of hope. Richard Blackstone had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for tax fraud, money laundering, and attempted bribery. Pinnacle Accounting had closed its doors permanently, but not before paying me $250,000 in wrongful termination damages. Margaret, whose real name was Helen Porter, smiled as she sat down next to me. "How are you feeling, Dan?" "Different," I replied honestly. "For 2 years, I felt like a failure. Now I know I was the victim of a criminal." Dorothy had passed away a week after our recording, but not before seeing her son publicly confess his crimes. In her final moments, She held my hand and whispered, "Thank you for giving him the chance to do the right thing." The federal investigation revealed that Richard had embezzled more than $2 million over 3 years. Marcus, the incompetent nephew, was fired the same day the agents arrived. Apparently, his corporate modernization included using company resources to fund his online gambling account. Linda had tried to come back when she heard about the settlement, but something fundamental had changed in me. The woman who kicked me out of the house because I wasn't man enough now wanted forgiveness because I had shown my true strength. "It doesn't work that way," I said when she showed up at my door. "You abandoned me when I needed support the most. Now I don't need your approval anymore." With part of the settlement, I started my own accounting consulting firm. I specialized in helping small family businesses avoid the very kind of corruption that nearly destroyed me. Within 9 months, I had 15 employees and a waiting list of clients. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was emotional. "Helen," I said, using her real name, "why did you really help me that day?" She was silent for a moment, her pale hands resting on her cane. "Because I recognized something in you that I had lost years ago. Quiet dignity. Strength without arrogance. And because some injustices are so clear that to ignore them is complicity." She turned to where I was sitting. "But mainly because you weren't seeking revenge, Dan. You were seeking truth. And truth, unlike revenge, always brings growth." Dorothy had left a final letter for me, which Helen gave me that day. It read, "Dan, my son confused power with character. You showed me the difference. Thank you for having integrity when it would have been easier to give in. The world needs more men like you." 3 weeks ago, I received an unexpected call. It was Michael Porter, the federal auditor. 3 other companies had been identified with schemes similar to Richard's, and they needed someone with my experience to assist in the investigations. "You have a unique reputation," he said. "Someone who not only understands numbers, but who cannot be corrupted." I accepted the consulting job. Not for the money, but because I had finally found my purpose, to protect honest people from predators like Richard. Helen got up to leave, but first she gave me one last piece of advice. "Dan, the difference between justice and revenge isn't in the outcome. It's in the intention. You never wanted to destroy Richard for pleasure. You wanted to protect other people from becoming his next victims. That's what makes you different from him." 2 days before Christmas, I ran into Richard in line at the supermarket. He was noticeably thinner, his hair gray, his clothes simple. When he saw me, his shoulders slumped. "Dan," he said quietly, "I want you to know that." "Richard," I interrupted him gently, "you've already paid the price. And I've already moved on. This is the only conversation we need to have." He nodded and moved forward in line, carrying only basic items in his basket. That night, I called my brother and said something I hadn't said in years. "You know what? I'm genuinely happy." If you're following this journey of overcoming and transformation, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments a time when you chose truth over revenge. Your stories inspire others to find strength in adversity. Today, 5 years after that meeting at the hospital, I run one of the most respected corporate ethics consulting firms in the state. Helen and I talk every week. Richard, from what I've heard, works as an accountant in a small town, living honestly for the first time in decades. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's becoming the person they never had the courage to be.